Hey guys, first of all, if you're not a pilot or at least interested in aviation or aeroplanes, you probably want to go and do something else because this video would be extremely boring for you probably. The only reason we're really making this video is because the information on flying in Japan and the license requirements and so on is really limited on the internet. There's not much information there, and what there is really isn't very useful, which is why we've made a Flying in Japan, Pilots in Japan playlist of videos about this topic, just to let people know exactly what is involved if you do want to fly in Japan, what you need to do. So the topic of this video is the pilot radio license, because we have talked about it previously, but we now have the whole story from beginning to end. So we thought that some people might be interested in this. So first of all, there's a few things that we should clarify first. One is, of course, you guys would know in a lot of other countries, usually the pilot radio license is issued by the same people who issue the pilot licenses, usually. So depending on what country you're from, that's usually the case, and it's usually just signed off by a flying instructor at some stage during your piloting career. So it's not normally a big issue. It's usually one of the simpler things involved in flying an aeroplane is getting the radio license. But in Japan it's different. In Japan the pilot licenses are handled by the JCAB, which is the Japan Civil Aviation Board, and the radio licenses are handled by the Telecommunications Department, which is 100% totally geared towards Japanese people. So even though you can fly a foreign registered aircraft into Japan and use the radio and land the aircraft and use the radio again and fly away, if you fly a Japanese registered aircraft in Japan, you will need a Japanese pilot license and a Japanese radio operator's license. So we covered what was required to get the Japanese pilot license in previous videos. And the last hurdle, one of the biggest hurdles, incredibly, is the radio license. In a lot of ways, it's actually more difficult than the pilot license. So it's unnecessarily so, perhaps, but it's just the way it is. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. One way is, we made a video recently telling you about the English option. We found an English option, which is, if you go to Tokyo, there's a 4-day course, which is quite incredible really, 4 whole days of training. And it's because the Japanese test isn't just about using the radio. Well, in actual fact, it's not really about using the radio at all. It's more about the technical aspects and a lot of stuff that pilots don't really need to know, really. Electronics, a portion of it is about electronics, and a portion of it's about the technical aspects and things that we don't really need to know as pilots. In fact, the electronic part of it, we're not actually allowed to touch the radios anyway, unless you're a licensed aircraft mechanical engineer. We're not allowed to modify the equipment or the antennas or anything else ourselves anyway. So more than probably 80% of the test is stuff that's not really relevant to pilots anyway, which actually makes it more difficult, because it means that even if you, in my case I was a commercial pilot in Australia, and even if you are a well-trained pilot who's gone through all the rules, all the training in your own country, there'll be a lot of this radio stuff you've never seen before, because it's stuff that we just don't use basically. So it's tricky. So there's a 4-day course in Tokyo that's run by a sort of a private organisation. Japan has a habit of doing this when you have licensing and requirements. What often happens is guys from that department, so in this case the telecommunications department, older guys who've retired from there, then start up their own little training facility. So you really end up having to go through one of these little groups and paying a lot of money to them in order to come out the other end with a radio operator's license, which again is quite incredible. But the course in Tokyo is a 4-day course, so you'd be up for 4 days and 3 nights of accommodation in Tokyo, and it costs about $1,000 and for the course, and another couple of hundred because to do it this way, we need to join the aircraft pilot, AOPA, Japan, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. So that's one way to do it, and the end result would be 3 nights accommodation in Tokyo plus. You'd probably looking at about $2,000. $2,000 and 4 days of your time in Tokyo. And then what they do is they give you a 4-day course in English, and at the end of it they give you a test in English, and you should walk away with the license and leave $2,000 behind and 4 days of your time. That's one option. The other option, which is sort of the crazy option, is to do it in Japanese. And to do that, what you need to do is you go to the site on the internet for the organisation who does this testing, which again is sort of a private organisation that does the tests, but it's comprised a lot of these sort of retired telecommunications department guys. It's a funny thing, it's a real Japanese thing. So you need to go on the internet, and there's a few places they do it. They do it in Tokyo, they do it in Nagoya, they do it in Osaka, and a couple of other places around Japan. And you go onto the internet, onto their website, you download a form from there that is basically putting your hand up to do the test, really, and saying that you want to do the test, and it says on there when the next one is. They usually do 2 a year, 2 tests a year. And then once you've got the piece of paper and you filled it all out, you go to the post office and you get a tax stamp for about $70. It's about 7,000 yen. And you put the tax stamp on that piece of paper, and then you send it off to these guys, and then a couple of weeks later you should get a piece of paper back that confirms where the test is being held. And because for some strange reason it varies where it's held. I've done the test 3 times, and each time was in a different location. One time was at a university, another time was in another building somewhere else, and each of the 3 times it was in a different place, which is odd. So, but anyway, that's the way it works. And then you turn up there for the test about half an hour before the test is actually due to start. And you need a pretty good level of Japanese to get through this whole process, because the first thing they do is they stand there and they spend 15 minutes explaining the rules and how the test itself is going to be administered and everything else. And then finally it starts, and what they do is they put a CD player on, and the CD player is a voice saying letters from the phonetic alphabet, 100 letters. Now, those of you who are pilots, when was the last time you heard anybody spelling anything out on the radio more than about 3 or 4 letters? It's pretty unusual, isn't it? But they do 100 letters. So it's like, you know, and about this pace: whiskey, alpha, November, kilo, echo, Romeo, about that pace, 100 letters. So you have to sit there with a pencil and write 100 letters as they say each phonetic character, each phonetic word, until you've written the 100 of them. And it's a fairly decent pace. You don't want to break your pencil or get stuck on something, because the pace is fairly fast, you know. So, but because you're listening to it in English or phonetics and then you're writing it down, it's not terribly hard to get through. You get through that, and then they take that piece of paper away, and then they bring you the other written part of the test, which is usually 4 pages. And as you can see, it's technical questions about radio, about transponders, direction finding equipment, antennas, electronics, and then some regulation questions about regulations, and about procedure, questions about procedure. Interestingly, there's no actual practical test. There's no actual using of the radio at any stage in this process. That you don't actually lay hands on a piece of equipment at all during any of this process. It's all just sitting in a room doing these tests, and there's no procedure. And the 50 or so people that were in the room, the testing people and the people that were sitting the test, none of them could speak English, which, considering that the international language for pilot radio is English, sort of ironic that everybody there doing the test couldn't speak English, and the test itself being administered in Japanese. But anyway, that was just the way it was. So that's your 4 pages, and obviously multiple choice, as you can see, and you have to sit there and mark your answers onto it's one of those little fill in the boxes type pieces of paper that gets fed into a computer later, so you've got to sit there and do it really neatly and very carefully. Again, a little bit of a tricky system to get your head around. Your Japanese obviously has to be pretty good to get through that bit, just a bit of a heads up. Some of you by now will be thinking that the $2,000 option might not be a bad one. And then at the end of that, then you go to another room and you do the opposite of the first test. So what they give you is 100 random letters, and you have to sit there, and the guy's got a stopwatch, and you have to sit there and you tell him when you're ready, and you say, okay, I'm beginning now in Japanese. You say, I'm beginning now in Japanese, and then you have to sit there and read those letters with phonetics. So Whiskey, Alpha, November, Kilo, Echo, Romeo, and he's timing you. And again, you've got about 100 to get through. Don't know how long, didn't actually get to the end of the stopwatch. I'm not sure how long it was, but you want to keep a pretty decent pace up to get through it. So again, that's not the one of the more difficult parts, it's one of the easier parts of the test. And then you leave, and then and usually about 3 or 4 weeks later or a month later, a card will turn up in your letterbox, and it will have either pass or fail written on it, basically. And if it says pass, it says congratulations, and then it says pass. So then, if you've passed that, then the next part of the procedure is to get onto the website for the Department of Telecommunications, and then download the piece of paper for the pilot radio license, which is this one. And interestingly, it gives you a list of things that it requires. So again, you have to go to the post office and get another tax stamp, which was, this one was, I can't remember, $50, $60, something like that. Another tax stamp, put that on the piece of paper, fill out the piece of paper, and then you have to include the card that said you passed the test, and you need to include, all it says is, you need to include a piece of identification that identifies that confirms your name and address. Now, for foreigners, our foreigner registration card, when they brought out the new foreigner registration card, they told us that foreigner registration card can be used for everything. They told us that we can use it to identify ourselves with all government departments and everything else. Now, it appears they didn't tell the telecommunications department that, because they didn't accept it, which is interesting, because actually for foreigners in Japan, the foreigner card is actually a high level of identification than the passport. You don't have to carry your passport, but you do have to carry this when you've got one of these. And now our residency status is actually only marked on this card. It's not actually marked on our passport anymore, which means this is more important. And of course this has our name and address, and all our details, our residency status and our picture and everything. So photocopy this as the name and address ID, proof of ID, and then you've got to put a self-addressed envelope with a stamp on it as well inside another envelope and send it to these guys. Now 2 days later, it all came back again with another letter saying, sorry, that information that you gave us wasn't adequate, we couldn't accept that piece of identification. Now, who knows why? It's possible that that department don't normally deal with foreigners, so they haven't seen a foreigner card before. That's quite possible. But for whatever reason, don't try and use your foreigner card, because it confuses them. And they didn't like it, and they said they wanted a, what do you call it, thing from City Hall. They've got this ID system here now, in Japan, they've had forever, where you're registered at City Hall, and you have to go to City Hall and get a piece of paper that has your name and address on it. Sort of like a birth certificate. It's not really a birth certificate, but in some countries the birth certificate is one of your most serious documents, and you can get original copies, and that's sort of what it is. You go to City Hall and you get this original copy that's actually impossible to photocopy. If you photocopy it, it comes out really odd. So you go to City Hall and get one of them, and that identifies you. Now, that's going to be tricky for some of you guys. If you are not in Japan real long term, you might not even have one of these. So it depends on your residency status, and it depends on a whole heap of things whether you actually have one of these at City Hall or not. If you don't, it's going to be tricky. You might have to give them a copy of your passport, or you might have to actually go into the department maybe with your original passport or something like that. It's incredible, isn't it? Let's keep in mind this is for a radio operator's license, right? You know, the amount of faffing and the amount of, we've talked about faffing before with these sorts of things in Japan. And, you know, when you consider that in most countries, this is just a stamp and a signature on your logbook by your flying instructor. You know, I remember in Australia at one stage flying some aeroplane one day for an endorsement, and the pilot, the instructor said, I never gave you your radio endorsement, did I? And we looked through the logbook, no, he didn't. And he went and got a stamp, and he stamped the logbook and signed it. And that's all it was to get the pilot. And I think most countries are the same. There's not usually any of this, you know. And then all this ID stuff, like, it's for a radio operator's license, you know. So anyway, did it again, put the document from the City Hall into the envelope, with the self-addressed envelope and with the copy of the piece of paper saying pass the test, and sent it away. And then about a week or 10 days later, another envelope arrived from the telecommunications department with a radio operator's license, which is actually a substantial hard piece of plastic, like a credit card sort of thing, with an amazing ID. You know, the holographic, it's got a holograph sort of thing in it. You probably won't be able to see on your screen, but it's a holograph of Mount Fuji and some other government stuff and trees and things. A whole beautiful scene, actually. You won't be able to see it, but when you've got it in your hand like this in your movie, you can see the holograph. So it's really high security piece of identification with a photo on it and everything. Radio operator's license. Isn't that incredible? Like, you know, I'll be interested to hear what you guys say. I haven't heard of any country anywhere that has such a high security type environment just to get a radio operator's license. But anyway, so those of you who've seen the videos about getting a pilot license to fly the aeroplane in Japan will probably agree that this was actually messier and it was more difficult. There was more Japanese involved. You know, it's sort of possible to get the pilot license in Japan without, if you've already got a pilot license from another country, it's possible that you can do it here. Just the documents, most of the documents in Japanese, but there's no real test in Japanese. The aviation law exam at Tokyo University was actually given to us in English, or given to me in English. It was given to everyone else in Japanese. So the radio by far was the most difficult part of the process, but anyway. There it was. So there's nothing really on the internet about this. Tried to find information on this. There's a couple of things. The AOPA, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association of Japan, have a small amount of information on it, and the Glider Association have a little bit of a small amount on it, and it's very vague, and it just says that foreigners who fly Japanese aircraft in Japan will need a radio operator's license, which might be difficult depending on your level of Japanese or something like that, and that's all they tell you. So everything that's been involved in doing this was sort of, you know, had to be sort of worked out as we went along, so there's no real information. That's why I made this long boring video. So if there is someone out there who's wanting to do this radio operator's license because they want to fly in Japan, that's what you're going to have to go through. So obviously that the biggest hurdle is that 4 pages of test in Japanese. There's a lot of kanji in there, and there's a lot of technical kanji. So preparing for this test 3 times, failed it twice and passed it on the 3rd attempt. And while studying for this, a few times asked Japanese family members, you know, do you know what this kanji is? And they were just looking at it, shaking their head, because it's technical stuff. So, you know, unless you've studied this subject in Japanese, you won't know the kanji. So it was a handful. It really was a handful. Incredible, isn't it? Just for a radio operator's license, you know. And at no stage during any of this process was a radio or a transponder or VOR or ADF or anything else used or tested on. None of it. And there was no actual communication test at all of actually using radio pilot, radio procedure stuff at all. Zero, nothing. So obviously they're just leaving that up to the flying instructors to teach that bit, and this is actually the bit with actually being able to use the radio, you know, so it's the strangest thing. Anyway, there it was. So hopefully there's someone in the world somewhere who will be watching this and going, great, there we go, finally I've got the information I was looking for. More videos coming soon.